October 17th, 1861. Leitrim, Ireland, 3:47 in the morning. Constable Patrick Byrne's lantern catches something moving on the abandoned barge. A small terrier, its white coat stained dark. The dog is sitting, perfectly still, guarding something. As Byrne climbs aboard, his boot slips on the wet deck. He steadies himself against the cabin wall and raises his lantern higher. The terrier doesn't move, doesn't bark, just stares at him with eyes that reflect the lamplight like copper pennies. Then Byrne sees what the dog is protecting, a canvas sack soaked through, and protruding from the top, human hair, matted with blood and canal water. The constable would later testify that the terrier had arranged itself between the sack and the world, as if performing some ancient duty of loyalty that transcended death itself. Byrne reached for the sack. The terrier's lips pulled back, revealing teeth, not in aggression, in grief. What Constable Byrne discovered inside that sack would expose a murderous conspiracy that had flourished for months along Ireland's inland waterways. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple killing. This was the work of a boatmen's guild that had turned the canals into their own private hunting ground, and the loyal terrier had witnessed everything. Before we uncover the truth about the Leitrim Canal barge dog and the midnight murder that exposed Ireland's most brutal waterway conspiracy, make sure to subscribe to The Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We're building a community of history seekers who refuse to let the darkest chapters be forgotten. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers scattered across the globe, united by our fascination with the shadows of the past. Now let's descend into the fog-shrouded canals of 1860s Ireland, where progress and brutality sailed side by side. Ireland in 1861 was a nation still reeling from the Great Famine's devastation. 15 years had passed since Black 47, but the scars remained carved into the countryside like wounds that refused to heal. The population had been nearly halved, through death, through emigration, through the simple erasure of entire villages from the map of human habitation. But the canals still ran with water, and water meant commerce. Water meant survival. The inland waterway system of Ireland represented one of the great engineering achievements of the 18th and 19th centuries. The Ballinamore and Ballyconnell navigation, completed in 1860, connected Lough Erne to the River Shannon, creating a continuous water route across the heart of the country. These canals were the arteries of a struggling economy, carrying coal, turf, grain, and livestock between isolated communities. The men who worked these waterways formed their own society, separate from the farmers and townspeople. Bargemen lived on their vessels for weeks at a time, navigating the intricate system of locks, aqueducts, and basins that transformed Ireland's rivers into highways. They developed their own hierarchy, their own codes, their own justice, and sometimes their own crimes. Thomas Brennan was 34 years old in the autumn of 1861, a third-generation bargeman who operated a turf transport vessel between Leitrim and Carrick-on-Shannon. His neighbors described him as a quiet man, competent at his trade, devoted to his small terrier named Pilot. The dog went everywhere with Brennan, a white fox terrier with a black patch over one eye, the kind of scrappy companion that seemed to embody the resilient spirit of the Irish working class. Brennan's barge, the Mary Catherine, was a 40-foot vessel typical of the Shannon navigation, flat-bottomed, with a small cabin at the stern and a hold that could carry 12 tons of cargo. He'd inherited it from his father, who'd inherited it from his father before him. The Mary Catherine was more than a business asset, it was the Brennan fam. Illy legacy floating on Irish waters. But in the summer of 1861, something changed along the canals. The Bargeman's Brotherhood, an informal association of waterway workers, had grown increasingly bold in its operations. What had begun as a mutual aid society, men helping each other through hard times, sharing information about cargo rates and water conditions, had evolved into something darker. The Brotherhood began enforcing territory. Certain stretches of canal belonged to certain men, and outsiders paid a toll or faced consequences. Thomas Brennan refused to pay. The first sign of trouble came in June, when Brennan discovered his mooring ropes had been cut at Drumleague Lock. His barge drifted half a mile downstream before he woke, and managed to regain control. He reported the incident to the lockkeeper, who noted it in his daily log with bureaucratic precision: rope sabotage, Brennan vessel investigation pending. No investigation followed. In July, Brennan's cargo of turf was found contaminated with river mud, ruining 3 tons of fuel that had been perfectly dry when loaded. The loss cost him 2 months' income. When he accused rival bargemen of tampering with his hold, witnesses suddenly couldn't recall seeing anything unusual. By August, the threats became explicit. A note, written in crude capitals, appeared nailed to the Mary Catherine's cabin door: "Pay the Brotherhood tax or pay in blood." Brennan showed the note to Constable Patrick Byrne during a chance meeting at Drumsna. Byrne, a conscientious officer with 15 years' service, copied the note into his official diary and promised to investigate. But the Royal Irish Constabulary was stretched thin across the countryside, and disputes between bargemen rarely rose to the level of serious police concern. That decision would haunt Byrne for the rest of his life. The canals in autumn take on a particular character. Mist rises from the water at dawn and dusk, creating corridors of gray through which barges move like ghosts. The locks empty and fill with rhythmic regularity, their mechanisms groaning and creaking with the weight of water and time. It's easy to disappear along these waterways, easy to vanish into the fog and never emerge. Thomas Brennan made his final cargo run on October 15, 1861, carrying 8 tons of turf from Leitrim to Carrick-on-Shannon. The lockkeeper at Battlebridge recorded his passage at 2:15 p.m. The weather was deteriorating, a cold front moving in from the Atlantic, bringing rain and wind that made navigation treacherous. Brennan was expected to arrive in Carrick-on-Shannon by nightfall. He never did. And little Pilot, the faithful terrier, began a vigil that would expose the rot at the heart of Ireland's canal system. The disappearance of Thomas Brennan should have triggered an immediate investigation, but the mechanisms of justice in 1861 Ireland moved with bureaucratic slowness. When Brennan failed to arrive at Carrick-on-Shannon on October 15th, the merchant waiting for his turf cargo simply assumed the bargeman had been delayed by weather. Autumn storms were common, delays were routine. By October 16th, concern began to ripple through the network of lockkeepers and harbor masters. The Mary Catherine hadn't passed through any of the downstream locks after Battlebridge. She hadn't moored at any of the recognized stopping points. The barge and its operator had simply vanished between 2 locks, a distance of less than 3 miles. Margaret Brennan, Thomas's wife, appeared at the constabulary station in Carrick-on-Shannon on the afternoon of October 16th. She was 31 years old, mother to 3 children, and already worn down by the hard life of a bargeman's family. Her testimony, preserved in the constabulary records, reveals a woman who understood that her husband's disappearance was no accident. "He told me they'd kill him if he didn't pay," she stated, her voice steady despite the tears running down her face. The Brotherhood, they wanted £5 a month, and Thomas said he'd rather die than give in to thieves and bullies. "I begged him to pay, I begged him." But £5 a month represented nearly half of Brennan's income. To pay would mean poverty, to refuse would mean what they all discovered soon enough. Constable Byrne organized a search party on October 16th, recruiting 4 additional constables and a dozen local men familiar with the waterways. They began at Battlebridge Lock and moved north, examining both banks of the canal for any sign of the missing barge. What they found instead were signs of a struggle. At a narrow section of canal called the Drumshanbo Narrows, searchers discovered rope fragments snagged on a tree branch overhanging the water. The rope was identified as the type used for mooring canal barges, thick hemp, weathered but strong. Someone had cut it with a blade, leaving clean edges that ruled out natural breakage. Nearby, on the towpath, investigators found evidence of multiple men, boot prints preserved in the soft earth, showing at least 4 different sets of footwear. The prints overlapped and churned the mud, suggesting a confrontation or violent struggle. One set of prints, smaller than the others, matched the measurements of Thomas Brennan's work boots, which Margaret provided for comparison. But no blood, no body, no barge. The Mary Catherine had disappeared as completely as if she'd sailed into another dimension. On the evening of October 16th, a local farmer named Seamus O'Donnell came forward with disturbing information. He'd been checking his cattle in a field adjacent to the canal around midnight on October 15th, when he heard men shouting. The voices carried across the water, harsh and angry, though O'Donnell couldn't make out specific words. There was splashing, he testified, like something heavy being dumped in the water, or men fighting in the shallows, and then a dog barking. Not aggressive barking, but the sound a dog makes when it's distressed. That went on for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped sudden-like. After that, nothing but the wind. O'Donnell hadn't investigated further. Rural Ireland in 1861 operated on a principle of deliberate ignorance. You didn't interfere in other men's business, especially at night, especially near the canals where the Brotherhood operated. but the sounds had troubled him enough that he mentioned them to his wife, who insisted he speak to the constabulary. The investigation intensified. Byrne questioned bargemen throughout the region, and a pattern of intimidation emerged that shocked even the experienced constable. At least 7 other waterway workers had received threats from the Brotherhood in the past 6 months. 3 had paid the demanded fees. 4 had refused, and of those 4, 2 had subsequently suffered mysterious accidents. 1 crushed between his barge and a lock wall, another drowned when he fell overboard during calm weather. Nobody had connected these incidents until now. Nobody had wanted to. The Brotherhood itself was a shadowy entity, with no formal membership roles or official structure. It appeared to be led by 3 men, Kieran Malloy, a barge operator from Drumshanbo, Patrick Cawley, who controlled several cargo vessels, and a man known only as the Dutchman, whose real name nobody would speak aloud. These 3 had apparently decided that the canal system was theirs to control, and they enforced that control through violence and fear. On October 17th, the investigation took a macabre turn. A local boy fishing for perch near an abandoned loading wharf noticed something odd about one of the derelict barges moored there. The vessel had been abandoned for years, its hull rotting and filled with rainwater. But now, something was moving on its deck. The boy ran to fetch his father, who brought Constable Byrne, and at 3:47 in the morning, in the gray pre-dawn light, Byrne climbed aboard the rotting barge and encountered the white Terror. Pilot sat in the center of the deck, beside a canvas sack that appeared to have been carefully placed there. The dog was soaking wet, shivering with cold, but refused to leave his post. When Byrne approached, the Terrier growled, not with aggression, but with the desperate determination of a creature guarding something precious. Byrne knelt down, speaking softly to the dog. "Easy now, boy, easy. Let me see what you've got there." The canvas was tied with cord at the top. As Byrne loosened the knots, his hands began to shake. He could smell death, sweet and coppery, mixed with the organic rot of canal water. The fabric was stiff with dried blood that had rehydrated in the damp air. He opened the sack. Thomas Brennan's head stared back at him with empty eyes. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. The truth about what happened on the Leitrim canals only gets darker from here, and your support helps us continue excavating these forgotten chapters of history. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. The story of Pilot the Terrier and his murdered master deserves to be remembered. Let's discover what happens next, because what the investigation uncovered would shake rural Ireland to its core. The canvas sack containing Thomas Brennan's severed head became Exhibit A in what would become one of Ireland's most sensational murder trials of the 1860s. But the immediate aftermath of its discovery revealed layers of horror that transcended the simple fact of murder. Constable Byrne's official report, written in the shaking hand of a man confronting unprecedented brutality, describes the scene with clinical precision that barely masks the psychological trauma beneath. The deceased's head had been severed from the body by means of a sharp implement, likely a large knife or small axe, applied with considerable force. The severance occurred between the 6th and 7th cervical vertebrae, suggesting either anatomical knowledge or multiple attempts. Lividity patterns indicate the victim was alive at the time of decapitation, time of death estimated between 36 to 48 hours prior to discovery. The head shows evidence of blunt force trauma to the right temple, delivered before death, possibly rendering the victim unconscious prior to execution. But the clinical language couldn't capture what Byrne actually experienced in that moment. The weight of the head as he lifted it from the sack, the way Brennan's expression seemed frozen in an attitude of surprise rather than fear, the realization that another human being had done this with deliberate purpose. And through it all, Pilot remained at his post. The Terrier had somehow retrieved his master's head, dragged or carried it from wherever the murder occurred, and brought it to this abandoned barge where someone would eventually find it. How long the journey took, how the small dog managed the gruesome task, these questions would never be fully answered. Veterinary examination later determined that Pilot had damaged his teeth in the process of moving the sack, suggesting he'd gripped the canvas and pulled it considerable distance. His paws were raw and bleeding. He was severely dehydrated and near collapse, but he hadn't abandoned his duty. The search for the rest of Thomas Brennan's body began immediately. Byrne organized a systematic sweep of the canal system, with teams of constables and volunteers dragging the waterway with grappling hooks and nets. The work was gruesome and difficult. The canal bottom was thick with mud and debris accumulated over decades. They found the torso on October 18th, weighted down with chains and anchor stones, submerged in a deep section of canal near Drumshanbo Narrows. The body bore multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen, 14 separate punctures delivered with such force that several had chipped the ribs and sternum. The medical examiner, Dr. James Murphy, noted in his autopsy report that the wounds suggested frenzied violence, personal rage, or a desire to send a message through excessive brutality. The limbs were never recovered. Based on the physical evidence, investigators reconstructed the probable sequence of events. Thomas Brennan had been ambushed while navigating the Drumshanbo Narrows on the night of October 15th. Multiple assailants had boarded his barge, overpowered him, and subjected him to a sustained assault that included beating, stabbing, and ultimately decapitation. The murder had been neither quick nor merciful. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came from examining Pilot's behavior in the days following the murder. Several witnesses reported seeing the white terrier near the murder site on October 16th, barking frantically and running back and forth along the towpath. The dog had apparently witnessed the killing and spent the subsequent day trying to alert anyone who would listen. When no help came, Pilot took matters into his own paws. The mechanics of how a small dog managed to retrieve a human head from either a barge or the canal itself and transport it to a location where it would be found challenges understanding. The sack containing the head weighed approximately 15 pounds, nearly as much as Pilot himself. Yet somehow the terrier had dragged or carried this burden through the darkness, across rough terrain, and positioned it on the abandoned barge, where young Michael Corrigan would spot it the following morning. Animal behavior experts consulted during the investigation suggested that Pilot had been trained in retrieval work, common for terriers used in hunting, but this went beyond mere training. This was devotion translated into action, loyalty that transcended the rational. The discovery of Brennan's remains also revealed crucial evidence about his killers. Fibers found embedded in the stab wounds matched fabric from a type of wool jacket commonly worn by canal bargemen. Under the victim's fingernails, medical examiners found skin tissue and blood. Brennan had fought back, marking at least one of his attackers. This biological evidence, while not yet sophisticated enough for individual identification in 1861, confirmed the presence of multiple assailants. Most damning of all was what investigators found aboard the Mary Catherine when they finally located her on October 19th. The barge had been deliberately sunk in a shallow section of canal 3 miles from the murder site, her hull scuttled to send her to the bottom. When constables raised the vessel and pumped out the water, they found blood saturating the wooden deck, so much blood that it had soaked into the timber grain, creating a dark stain that no amount of canal water could wash away. They also found Brennan's cargo manifest, which listed his load of turf and the payment he expected to receive in Carrick-on-Shannon, £4, 10 shillings. The Brotherhood had murdered a man for refusing to pay a protection fee while simultaneously destroying cargo worth nearly the same amount. It wasn't about money, it was about control, about making an example, about demonstrating that the Brotherhood's authority superseded law, morality, and human decency. In the cabin of the Mary Catherine, investigators discovered Brennan's personal effects: a pipe, a change of clothes, a small prayer book, and a leather collar that belonged to Pilot. The collar was sized for a growing puppy, suggesting that Brennan had owned the terrier since it was young. The two had likely been companions for years, working the canals together, sleeping in the cramped cabin together, sharing the hardships of a bargeman's life. And when Thomas Brennan died, Pilot had refused to accept that death meant the end of service. The dog had transformed grief into purpose, horror into mission. He had retrieved his master's head and delivered it to justice with the same determination he'd once used to retrieve game birds. Dr. Murphy, the medical examiner, included an unusual addendum in his autopsy report. I must note for the record that in 30 years of practicing medicine, I have never encountered a case where an animal demonstrated such profound understanding of human mortality and justice. The dog Pilot appears to have grasped that his master's death was wrong, that it required human intervention, and that the head itself served as evidence of a crime. This suggests cognitive capabilities we typically do not attribute to canines. I am at a loss for scientific explanation. The discovery had transformed a missing persons case into a murder investigation. But more than that, it had exposed the violent undercurrent flowing through Ireland's canal system. Hidden beneath the mundane commerce of turf and grain, the waterways that connected communities had become arteries of terror, controlled by men who believed themselves above the law. and one small white terrier with a black patch over his eye had dragged the truth into the light, one horrible burden at a time. The murder of Thomas Brennan ignited outrage across rural Ireland and forced the Royal Irish Constabulary to confront the reality of organized crime on the inland waterways. Within days of identifying Brennan's remains, a special investigation unit was established under Inspector William Russell, a veteran officer known for his relentless pursuit of justice and his refusal to be intimidated by criminal conspiracies. Russell's first action was to place every member of the suspected Brotherhood under surveillance. Kieran Molloy, Patrick Cawley, and the mysterious Dutchman, identified as a former sailor named Willem van Houten, all had their movements tracked, their associates interviewed, and their barges searched for evidence connecting them to the murder. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On October 22nd, a bargeman named Liam Quinn appeared at the constabulary station with his face swollen and bruised. He'd been beaten by Brotherhood enforcers for speaking to investigators, but the assault had destroyed whatever loyalty he'd felt toward the organization. Quinn provided detailed testimony about the Brotherhood's operations, including specific information about the night Thomas Brennan died. Quinn testified that he'd been present at a Brotherhood meeting on October 14th, where the three leaders had openly discussed dealing with the Brennan problem. Molloy had advocated for violence, stating that soft treatment breeds contempt and contempt breeds defiance. Cawley had agreed, suggesting they make Brennan an example that every bargeman on these waterways will remember. Van Houten had been more pragmatic. According to Quinn's testimony, the Dutchman had recommended they simply sink Brennan's barge and claim it was an accident, but Molloy had overruled him, insisting that fear was more effective than plausible deniability. They wanted people to know it was murder, Quinn stated. They wanted everyone to understand what happens when you refuse the Brotherhood. Kieran said they'd leave bits of Brennan scattered along the canal as a warning. Patrick laughed and said maybe they'd mail his head to the constabulary as a gift. This testimony established premeditation and conspiracy, elevating the crime from spontaneous violence to calculated assassination. But Quinn couldn't provide direct evidence of who had actually killed Brennan. He hadn't been present at the murder itself, and the Brotherhood's leaders had been careful to avoid explicit confessions even among their own members. The investigation turned to physical evidence and forensic analysis. Dr. Murphy's examination of the skin tissue found under Brennan's fingernails revealed blood type information that, while primitive by modern standards, could eliminate suspects. In 1861, the ABO blood type system hadn't been discovered, but medical examiners could identify certain blood characteristics through microscopic examination. More useful was the fiber evidence. The wool fragments found in Brennan's wounds matched a specific type of jacket manufactured by a Dublin textile mill and sold primarily to merchants supplying canal workers. Constables visited every outfitter along the Shannon navigation, compiling a list of men who'd purchased such jackets in the past 2 years. Kieran Molloy's name appeared on 3 separate purchase records. On October 28th, Inspector Russell obtained a warrant to search Molloy's barge and personal residence. What they discovered provided the final pieces of the evidentiary puzzle. In a storage locker beneath Molloy's cabin, constables found a jacket matching the fiber evidence, and it bore a 6-inch tear along the left sleeve, consistent with having been ripped during a violent struggle. More damning still was what they found in Molloy's personal effects, a notebook containing detailed records of Brotherhood taxes collected from various bargemen, including a line item noting Brennan refused October 15th. The entries that followed were chillingly bureaucratic: material and disposal costs, 2 shillings, 6 pence lockkeeper payment, 5 shillings distribution of assets, Mary Catherine cargo sold, proceeds divided 3 ways. Molloy had documented the murder and its aftermath, as if it were a routine business transaction. Arrests followed swiftly. Kieran Molloy was taken into custody on October 29th. Patrick Cawley was arrested the following day while attempting to flee toward Dublin. Willem van Houten proved more elusive. He'd apparently anticipated the investigation and disappeared into the maritime networks he'd cultivated during his sailing days. He wouldn't be captured until December, found aboard a cargo ship preparing to depart from Cork Harbour. The trial began on February 4, 1862, at Carrick-on-Shannon Courthouse. The proceeding attracted national attention, with newspapers from Dublin, Belfast, and even London sending correspondents to cover what they termed the Canal murder trial. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, bargemen, merchants, families of victims, and the simply curious drawn to witness justice for an atrocity that had shocked the nation. The prosecution, led by Crown Counsel Bernard O'Hara, built their case methodically. They presented Quinn's testimony about the Brotherhood meeting, the physical evidence linking Malloy to the crime scene, and the financial records documenting the conspiracy. They called Margaret Brennan to testify about the threats her husband had received, and her testimony, delivered with quiet dignity despite her obvious grief, moved many in the courtroom to tears. But perhaps the most dramatic moment came when the prosecution introduced their final witness, Pilot. The little white terrier was brought into the courtroom on a lead held by Constable Byrne. The dog had been living with Byrne since the investigation began, forming a new bond with the officer who'd discovered his master's remains. As Pilot entered the chamber, spectators reported that Malloy's face went pale, and he gripped the defendant's table with white-knuckled hands. O'Hara used Pilot's presence to dramatic effect. He recounted the dog's vigil, his desperate attempt to bring justice for his murdered master, and his loyalty that transcended death itself. This dog, gentleman of the jury, demonstrated more honor and courage than the men who killed his master, O'Hara declared. While these defendants conspired in shadows, while they calculated profit from murder, while they believed themselves beyond the reach of law and justice, this faithful creature dragged the truth into the light. If a dog can recognize evil and fight against it, surely 12 men of reason and conscience can do the same. The defense attorneys, court appointed, as none would take the case willingly, attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the Brotherhood's protection racket didn't automatically implicate their clients in murder, that perhaps Brennan had been killed by UN known assailants, and the Brotherhood was being scapegoated. But the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges for all 3 defendants: murder with malice aforethought, conspiracy to commit murder, and extortion under the 1861 Criminal Code. The judge, Lord Justice Arthur Campbell, delivered the sentence with cold precision. You 3 men transformed the waterways of Ireland into corridors of terror. You corrupted a legitimate trade organization into an engine of extortion and violence. And you murdered Thomas Brennan not in passion, not in self-defense, but as a calculated act of intimidation designed to subjugate your fellow workers through fear. For these crimes, you shall hang by the neck until dead, and may God have mercy on your souls, for this court has none. The executions were carried out on March 19, 1862, at Carrick-on-Shannon Gaol. By all accounts, Willem van Houten went to the gallows with stoic acceptance. Patrick Cawley broke down sobbing and had to be supported by guards, and Kieran Malloy maintained his defiance to the end, spitting at the chaplain who offered last rites. But the story of justice for Thomas Brennan didn't end with the hangings. The Bargeman's Brotherhood collapsed immediately after the trial, its remaining members either fleeing the waterways or attempting to reinvent themselves as legitimate workers. The protection racket evaporated overnight, and canal commerce returned to normal operations for the first time in months. Margaret Brennan received financial compensation from the seizure and sale of the defendant's assets, enough to support her children and eventually purchase a small shop in Carrick-on-Shannon, which she ran successfully for 3 decades. She never remarried, keeping the name Brennan until her death in 1893. And Pilot? The white terrier became something of a celebrity. Constable Byrne formally adopted him, and the dog lived out his remaining years as an unofficial mascot of the Royal Irish Constabulary's Leitrim division. Newspaper accounts from the period describe Pilot accompanying Byrne on his rounds, sitting patiently outside shops while the constable conducted business, and receiving treats from townspeople who recognized him as the dog who'd solved a murder. When Pilot died in 1867 at the estimated age of 11, Constable Byrne had him buried in his own family plot, with a small headstone that read, Pilot, faithful unto death and beyond. He brought justice for his master when men would not. The case had broader reverberations throughout Irish society. The Dublin authorities launched investigations into similar protection rackets operating in other trade sectors: dock workers, market vendors, and transport drivers. The Brennan murder had exposed how easily criminal conspiracies could flourish when communities were too intimidated to resist, and too isolated for law enforcement to notice. Parliament eventually passed the Waterways Protection Act of 1863, which established a dedicated constabulary unit to patrol Ireland's canal system and investigate crimes occurring on or near inland waterways. The legislation directly cited the Brennan case as evidence of the need for specialized law enforcement in these previously neglected corridors of commerce. But perhaps most significantly, the story of Pilot and his murdered master became embedded in Irish folklore. The tale was retold in pubs and homes, evolving with each retelling but always maintaining its core truth: that loyalty and justice sometimes come from unexpected sources, that evil can be defeated when good refuses to look away, and that the smallest creature can demonstrate the greatest courage. Local historians in Leitrim maintain that on foggy nights near Drumshanbo Narrows, you can sometimes hear a dog barking, not aggressive barking, but the distressed sound of a terrier who witnessed something terrible and desperately wants someone to listen. They call it Pilo. T's warning, and bargemen who still work these waterways claim to feel a presence watching over them when they pass through that narrow stretch of canal. It's probably just legend, of course. Probably just the wind and water creating sounds that the human mind interprets as something more meaningful. But the constabulary records are real. The trial transcripts are real. And somewhere in Leitrim, there's a small gravestone marking the resting place of a white terrier with a black patch over his eye. A dog who loved his master enough to drag horror into the daylight, because darkness can only survive when good souls refuse to see. The murder of Thomas Brennan and its resolution through Pilate's determination had consequences that rippled far beyond the canals of Leitrim. The case became a turning point in how Victorian society understood both criminal organizations and animal intelligence, forcing conversations that challenged prevailing assumptions about power, justice, and the nature of loyalty itself. The immediate impact was the complete dismantling of protection rackets along Ireland's inland waterways. The Royal Irish Constabulary's newly formed Waterways Protection Unit conducted sweeping investigations that uncovered similar extortion operations in at least 7 other regions. By 1864, more than 40 men had been arrested and prosecuted for crimes ranging from intimidation to assault to murder connected with illegal protection schemes. The Brennan case had demonstrated that these criminals were not untouchable, that their culture of silence could be broken, and that justice could reach even into the isolated corridors of rural Ireland. The deterrent effect was profound. Canal workers who'd lived under the Brotherhood's thumb for years suddenly found the courage to report crimes, to testify against their oppressors, to reclaim their livelihoods from men who'd treated the waterways as personal fiefdoms. But the case also forced British and Irish authorities to confront uncomfortable questions about how such criminality had been allowed to flourish. The Brotherhood had operated for at least 2 years before Brennan's murder, and likely longer. Multiple bargemen had been injured or killed under suspicious circumstances, yet no serious investigation had been launched until a victim's severed head was discovered guarded by his faithful dog. Contemporary newspaper editorials savaged the constabulary's complacency. The Irish Times published a scathing piece on March 22, 1862, that it required the devotion of a loyal terrier to accomplish what paid officers of the law could not, or would not, achieve speaks to a failure of institutional will that demands immediate remedy. How many Thomas Brennans must die before the apparatus of justice functions as intended? How many dogs must carry their masters' heads to our doorsteps before we acknowledge our collective shame? The criticism spurred reforms beyond just the Waterways Protection Unit. The Royal Irish Constabulary implemented new protocols requiring serious investigation of any suspicious death among trade workers, established better communication systems between rural outposts, and created incentive structures for officers who proactively identified organized criminal activity. The case also contributed to evolving attitudes about animal intelligence and emotion. Victorian society generally viewed animals as lesser creatures, capable of training and instinct but not of reasoned thought or moral understanding. Pilate's actions challenged that framework in ways that couldn't easily be dismissed. Natural philosophers and early animal behaviorists studied the case extensively. Dr. Edmund Fairfax, a prominent London veterinarian and animal welfare advocate, published a detailed analysis in the Journal of Veterinary Science arguing that Pilate's behavior demonstrated cognitive capabilities including problem-solving, understanding of causation, recognition of injustice, and the ability to formulate and execute a plan requiring multiple steps toward a distant goal. Fairfax's work, directly inspired by the Brennan case, contributed to growing movements for animal welfare and protection. If animals could demonstrate such sophisticated thought and emotion, the argument went, didn't society have greater obligations toward their humane treatment? The case of Pilate became rhetorical ammunition for activists fighting against animal cruelty in farming, entertainment, and research. Parliament eventually passed the Cruelty to Animals Act of 1876, which expanded protections for domestic and working animals. While the legislation had many influences, contemporary debates referenced the Brennan case repeatedly as evidence that animals deserved consideration as sentient beings capable of suffering and loyalty. The story also influenced literary culture. Charles Dickens, in his final years, mentioned the case in correspondence as an example of devotion that surpassed human examples. Wilkie Collins contemplated a novel based on the events but never completed it. Irish poet William Allingham composed The Ballad of Pilot's Watch, which circulated widely in folk tradition and is still occasionally performed in traditional music circles. The cultural resonance reveals something profound about what the case represented to Victorian audiences. Here was a story that combined horror and heroism, that demonstrated loyalty transcending death, that showed courage coming from unexpected sources. In an age of rapid industrialization and social disruption, when traditional communities were fragmenting and old certainties crumbling, the image of a small dog refusing to abandon his duty resonated deeply. But perhaps the most significant implication was what the case revealed about the nature of justice itself. The legal system had failed Thomas Brennan in life, had ignored his complaints, dismissed his fears, and left him vulnerable to predators. Only in death, only through the extraordinary actions of his dog, did justice finally arrive. This uncomfortable truth sparked debates about whether the law existed to protect the vulnerable or merely to punish the guilty after harm had been done. Progressive reformers argued that the Brennan case demonstrated the need for proactive protection, for systems that prevented crime rather than simply responding to it after victims had paid the ultimate price. Conservative voices pushed back, arguing that no system could prevent all violence, that the Brotherhood's collapse demonstrated the law's effectiveness once properly engaged. But even traditionalists struggled to explain why it had taken a dog to engage that law in the first place. The tension between these perspectives shaped criminal justice reform throughout the remainder of the 19th century. The principles of preventative policing, community protection, and proactive intervention that eventually became standard practice owed debts to cases like Brennan's, where the catastrophic failure of deterrence had been undeniable. The Brennan murder also became a touchstone in debates about organized crime and how society should respond to groups that established parallel power structures. The Brotherhood had functioned essentially as a criminal government, collecting taxes, enforcing regulations, and dispensing justice according to its own codes. While hardly unique, similar organizations existed in cities and industrial centers. The Brotherhood's rural operation made it particularly visible and symbolically powerful. Law enforcement professionals studied the case as an example of how to dismantle such organizations, gather detailed intelligence, find witnesses willing to break the code of silence, follow financial trails, and strike decisively once sufficient evidence was compiled. These tactics, refined in subsequent decades, became standard approaches to combating organized crime throughout the British Empire and beyond. The case even influenced international law enforcement. American police departments studying the case in the 1870s and 1880s drew parallels to their own struggles with organized crime in rapidly growing cities. The Brotherhood's protection racket resembled operations run by criminal gangs in New York, Boston, and Chicago. The successful prosecution of Malloy, Cawley, and Van Houten provided a template for how to build cases against similar organizations. On a more intimate level, the Brennan case affected how working-class Irish communities understood their relationship with authority. For generations, rural Ireland had operated on principles of self-sufficiency and mutual obligation, often viewing the constabulary and British legal system with suspicion or hostility. The successful prosecution of the Brotherhood demonstrated that sometimes the formal mechanisms of justice could serve common people against common predators. This didn't erase centuries of complicated history between Ireland and Britain, but it created moments of alignment, instances where shared interests in security and justice overcame political divisions. The legacy of those moments would influence how Irish society navigated its complex path toward independence in the 20th century. The physical locations connected with the case became sites of memory and pilgrimage. Drumshanbo narrows about justice, accountability, and the obligations we owe to one another. What do you think drove Kieran Malloy and his accomplices to such brutal acts? Was it pure greed, or something darker, a desire for power and control that transcended financial motivation? Leave your theories in the comments below. Our community always brings fascinating perspectives to these historical mysteries. And what about Pilot? Can we really explain his actions through instinct and training alone, or did this faithful terrier demonstrate something we might call love, loyalty, and a sense of justice that transcends species? If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. The Silent Abbey brings you forgotten chapters of history every week. The stories they don't teach in schools, the shadows that hide between the lines of official records, the human dramas that reveal who we are at our best and worst. Check out our other videos on historical mysteries and true crime from the Victorian era. And remember, history isn't just dates and names. It's people like Thomas Brennan, struggling to earn an honest living. It's criminals like the Brotherhood, corrupting decent institutions. And sometimes, it's a small white terrier with a black patch over his eye, refusing to let evil win without a fight. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another dark chapter in history that deserves to be remembered.